Think about your grandparents. You love them, but sometimes their views are disappointing, if not embarrassing. I remember when my grandfather asked me, right in front of my friends, "What are you doing hanging out with that girl? You know she ain't up to no good." I remember all the tall tales he would tell me about how his daddy was so strong he could lift a 400-pound log with one arm, or how he was such a good marksman that he could shoot the head off a dragonfly from halfway across the Mississippi River. Our generation is too well educated to believe these stories. We have so much knowledge at our fingertips that people from even a few generations ago are ignorant in comparison. And that's good. That's the way it should be. That's called progress. Now think about your parents. Think back to some of the things they might have taught you when you were a kid. Rub the dog's nose in it. That'll teach him to stop peeing on the floor. Don't sit too close to the TV. It might make you go blind. Rub some brandy on the baby's gums while he's teething. It worked for you when you were a child. It is understandable that our parents clung to these falsities. They didn't know any better. The information was simply too hard to acquire. In order for them to find out the truth, they had to go to the library and look it up. And sometimes the studies confirming or debunking these myths had not yet been conducted or circulated. On top of that, many of the recent studies were not even possible before the advent of grid computing. That is, the technology that makes it possible to rapidly process terabytes of data to help us understand complex things. Now go back a few hundred years. After the invention of the printing press, but before the invention of things like the incandescent light bulb, the gas lamp, the kerosene lamp, or even whale oil lamps. The inability to light one's home at night was a major retardant for general literacy. How hard was it to read at night? Well, back in those days, proper lighting was a luxury that even the wealthy had to use sparingly. Most people made their own candles from dried rush piths and leftover mutton fats. These rush lights, as they were called, required significant planning because rush plants were gathered only once per year, and a typical 12-inch rush light only lasted 15 to 20 minutes. Rush lights also require a supply of animal fats, which many peasants could not afford because they did not have animals to slaughter. A cheaper alternative was the tallow candle. Tallow candles were messy and stinky. They burned with uneven light, and they required wick trimming up to 40 times per hour. People who could afford beeswax candles used them sparingly, and they typically only brought them out to show off their wealth when they had dinner guests. Glass windows were also prohibitively expensive in those times. As a result, houses were very dark and most people did not read. Case in point, after the introduction of the ever-so-bright gas lamp in the mid-19th century, the number of newspapers and periodicals in Britain leapt from fewer than 150 at the start of the century to almost 5,000 by the end of it. Worldwide literacy rates also leapt from an estimated 40% in 1800 to 60% worldwide in 1900. Now go back before the printing press. In the 14th century, 80% of adults in England could not even spell their own names. The fact is that it was not economical to learn to read. For most of the population, the inability to read meant nothing in terms of marketable skills. If you had the time to learn to read, then you were among the super elite. In terms of literacy, it really does not matter how far back you go before this point, whether it is 700 years ago or many thousand years ago. Before the internet, before the light bulb, before the printing press, before general literacy, most people were so ignorant that they could not hold a reasonable conversation with you about relatively simple topics like geography, women's rights, universal suffrage, or why it is important to wash your hands before dinner. I spent all this time talking about literacy and ignorance for a reason. It is important to put things into perspective because it affects the way we look at stories in our holy books, like the Bible. I grew up reading the Bible and accepting all the fantastical passages therein as truth. I recently watched an extremely well-produced miniseries called The Bible on the History Channel. One of the things that struck me about this series was the way the actors looked. Look at these guys. Abraham, King David, Paul of Tarsus, Jesus. Every one of them has perfect teeth. Nobody had teeth like that in those times. Jesus definitely did not have teeth like that, because if he did, the Gospels would say something like, everyone knew right away that Jesus was God because of his perfect white shining teeth. If they made the actors look a bit more like real ancient people, with rotting teeth, ragged hair and beards, and handmade clothes, it would probably help to give you the right perspective on how ignorant these people actually were. This is an extremely subtle point, but I do believe that when you see characters with perfect white teeth, You automatically associate them with modern people who have access to the information and technology that make it possible to have clean, straight, white teeth well into adulthood. But if you saw the real Jesus in all his glory, with his teeth rotting out, then you might more appropriately associate him with a time when people really were too ignorant for words. When I think about all those fantastical stories in the Bible, and when I think about the fact that the people who wrote these passages, inspired by God or not, were so ignorant, so racist, so sexist, so superstitious, and so rough around the edges that I would be embarrassed to have them at a dinner party, suddenly those texts that seemed so magical start to sound a lot more like those tales from my grandfather. Except the tales in the Bible are amplified by generation upon generation of retelling before they were written down. It started with ignorance, and then it grew and grew and grew and became so fantastical that, oh wow, God was so mysterious and so magical back then. Why on earth does he refuse to do all those amazing things today when he did them so freely for illiterate people thousands of years ago?